June 6, 1944, 00:15 hours, 12,000 feet above the English Channel. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann's routine patrol ended when his navigator broke protocol with 3 words that would be recorded in his after-action report: "My God, look." Hartmann looked. The channel was moving, not the water, the surface itself. Dark shapes stretched horizon to horizon, transforming empty sea into solid steel. He dropped to 8,000 feet for confirmation. Ships, not a fleet. An ocean of vessels extending beyond visual range in every direction. Hartmann ordered a count. Navigator Muller's pencil moved across his notepad. 20, 40, 60 ships documented before the counting became meaningless. His final notation in the patrol log would read simply, "Too many to enumerate with accuracy." Think about that. A reconnaissance officer trained specifically to count enemy forces couldn't count because the enemy exceeded the capacity for counting. German intelligence had calculated maximum Allied capability at 500 ships. That number, considered wildly optimistic by most analysts, had formed the basis of every defensive plan. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to repel 300 ships maximum. Panzer reserves had been positioned to counter forces from 300 ships. Authorization protocols had been calibrated for threats of that magnitude. Hartmann was documenting something that made 300 look like a coastal patrol. Not wrong by a margin of error, wrong by an order of magnitude that transformed German defensive strategy from calculated risk into mathematical impossibility. Müller reported an estimate based on density calculations, approximately 2,000 vessels visible in his sector, representing perhaps 1/3 of the total formation. 2,000 in 1/3 suggested 6,000 total, possibly 7,000, 20 times the maximum German estimate. Hartmann broke radio silence with priority transmission at 00:23 hours. His message, preserved in Luftwaffe communications archives, stated that multiple surface contacts had been detected, estimating a minimum of 6,000 vessels on course for the Normandy coast, with immediate alert recommended for all coastal commands. The response came within 30 seconds, instructing him to return to base immediately, suggesting that his navigation equipment might be malfunctioning and requiring technical inspection upon landing. Coastal Command believed his instruments had failed. While the largest invasion in human history crossed the Channel, German headquarters assumed his compass was broken. Müller transmitted clarification that navigation had been confirmed through multiple cross-checks, that the contacts were real vessels, repeating the estimate of 6,000 vessels minimum and stating clearly that this was the invasion. Another pause followed. Then the response came that he should return to base immediately and that his report would be evaluated upon landing. Evaluated. The word meant dismissed, meant filed away as equipment malfunction while 7,000 ships established themselves on French beaches. Hartmann captured one photograph at 00:47 hours before turning toward his base in France. The photograph would become Exhibit 847A in Allied intelligence files. Photo analysts would spend 2 days counting individual vessels visible in the frame. Final count, 847 ships in a single photograph, representing less than 1/6 of the total invasion fleet. As Hartmann's aircraft turned south, he made one final observation that he recorded in his log. The notation would later be used in court-martial proceedings against him for defeatism. He wrote that Germany had lost the war, that mathematics had already decided the outcome. Müller understood the implications of that statement immediately. Saying such things constituted defeatism under Wehrmacht regulations. Defeatism was treason. Treason typically resulted in execution, but Müller wrote nothing in his own log disputing Hartmann's assessment, because Hartmann was correct. Germany possessed approximately 150 naval vessels total across all theatres. The Allies had brought 7,000 ships to one beach on one morning. That mathematics meant they could repeat this operation tomorrow, next week, every week, forever. This wasn't their navy being committed to a desperate gamble. This was what they had built specifically for today. What Hartmann didn't know from 10,000 feet was that many of those concrete structures being towed behind ships were artificial harbours, entire functioning ports constructed in England, transported across the Channel, because American planners had calculated that building harbours was faster than capturing them intact. What Hartmann didn't know was that beneath his aircraft, invisible in the darkness, a fuel pipeline ran along the sea floor from England to France. Because Allied logistics planners had determined that laying pipe across 60 miles of seabed was more efficient than conventional fuel transport, what Hartmann didn't know was that American shipyards completed one Liberty ship every 42 hours at peak production, that they built cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, that the ships he was witnessing represented not the limit of Allied capability, but merely what they had allocated for today's operation. What Hartmann didn't know was that 600 miles away in Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler was sleeping. The Führer, who demanded personal control of every significant military decision, was absent from the moment that would decide everything. Hitler had left explicit orders not to be wakened unless the invasion began. The invasion had begun 4 hours earlier. But Hitler would sleep 7 more hours, while 156,000 soldiers established a beachhead that would never be eliminated, not through incompetence, through systematic intelligence failure so complete that reality itself had become unbelievable to those charged with recognizing it. The mathematics of 7,000 ships would be written in blood by dawn, but at 0047 hours, Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann already understood the fundamental equation. 7,000 ships didn't represent military capability. They represented civilizational capacity, the capacity to build faster than enemies could destroy, to produce faster than enemies could consume, to create abundance that made scarcity obsolete. Germany could fight brilliantly. It didn't matter. Mathematics doesn't care about courage. Arithmetic doesn't yield to ideology. By the time Hartmann landed at 0147 hours, his report dismissed as instrument malfunction, the war was already over. The dying just hadn't stopped yet. March 1944. Adolf Hitler positioned his hand over Pas-de-Calais on the operations map and stated what he considered obvious strategic truth that any competent military analyst should recognize immediately. This was where the Allies would land. The logic was inescapable. No one in the room contradicted him. Not Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, not Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, not General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht Operations. Silence in Hitler's headquarters always signaled consent. Dissent had become professionally fatal. Hitler's reasoning was impeccable by every standard of military logic. The Channel measured 33 kilometers at its narrowest point between Dover and Calais. The Allies required massive supply lines to sustain operations. They would logically choose the shortest route to minimize vulnerability. Simple tactical logic. The logic was perfect. The logic was also fatally, catastrophically wrong. Hitler had positioned the 15th Army at Calais, 19 divisions, 300,000 men, Germany's largest concentration of defensive power in France. When the Allies landed at Calais, he assured his commanders they would be destroyed on the beaches within hours. Rommel shifted his position slightly during this briefing. He had spent 3 months inspecting Atlantic Wall fortifications. He had submitted comprehensive reports documenting critical weaknesses, construction materials arriving at 1/3 required rates, labor crews at half capacity, beach obstacles deployed at 1/10 specified density. But Rommel submitted reports. He didn't contradict the Führer's strategic assessments, not in these meetings, not anymore. The intelligence supporting Hitler's certainty appeared comprehensive. Radio intercepts revealed the 1st United States Army Group, designated FUSAG, assembling in southeast England opposite Calais, 12 divisions, 150,000 men, commanded by General George Patton, whom German intelligence correctly identified as the Allies' most aggressive and dangerous field commander. Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance had photographed the evidence repeatedly. Landing craft concentrated in Dover. Fuel dump facilities, ammunition storage areas, troop encampments, all positioned across the Channel from Calais. German agents operating in Britain, or believed to be operating in Britain, reported unprecedented activity, convoy movements toward Dover, increased security around embarkation facilities, troop concentrations in southeast England reaching critical mass. Every intelligence source pointed toward Calais. Every piece of evidence confirmed Hitler's strategic assessment. The certainty was universal. What German intelligence didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that FUSAG didn't exist. Every landing craft was inflatable rubber, every tank was plywood and canvas, every fuel dump was painted fabric, every convoy was the same trucks photographed repeatedly from different angles. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan, was feeding German intelligence exactly what they wanted to believe, and German intelligence, at every level from field agents to high command, believed everything. The Atlantic Wall itself was real enough. 3 years of construction, 17 million cubic meters of concrete poured into 15,000 fortifications, 500,000 obstacles emplaced along beaches. The physical infrastructure of defense was formidable, but the wall had fatal weaknesses that reports documented but leadership ignored: chronic material shortages, persistent manpower deficiencies. Most critically for what was coming, Hitler had placed all panzer reserves under central command authority. They couldn't move without his personal authorization that would come far too late. After the March briefing, Rommel attempted private discussion with Jodl regarding panzer positioning. Jodl's response was documented in his daily log. The Führer's orders were explicit and not subject to field modification. Panzers would remain under central command. Rommel pressed the tactical reality. If invasion came to any coastline, every hour would matter exponentially. Tanks positioned hundreds of miles from landing beaches would arrive too late, regardless of how quickly authorization came. Jodl's recorded response stated that authorization would come quickly. The Führer understood time factors and would respond appropriately when invasion materialized. 6 panzer divisions sat in France, over 1,200 modern tanks, enough armored firepower to destroy any landing force attempting to establish a beachhead. If they could reach the beaches within hours of landing, but none could move without Hitler's explicit authorization. This requirement, sensible in theory for preventing unauthorized movements, would doom Germany before the first Allied soldier reached French sand. Meanwhile, in Hamburg, Feldwebel Otto Goth received a letter from his brother serving with the 352nd Infantry Division in France. The letter, preserved in family archives and later donated to the Bundesarchiv, expressed complete confidence. The Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, every position interlocked with supporting positions, every approach was registered for artillery, every beach obstacle calculated to stop landing craft at the waterline. The letter stated with certainty that when the Allies came, they would be thrown back into the sea within hours. Goth wanted to believe his brother, needed to believe, because the alternative, that Germany might lose this war, remained unthinkable to most German civilians in early 1944, despite the Eastern Front's collapse and the strategic bombing campaign's escalation. Meanwhile, at Omaha Beach, Oberst Ernst Goth, no relation to the Hamburg Feldwebel, inspected Widerstandsnest 62 and felt professionally satisfied with defensive preparations. 4 155mm guns positioned for interlocking fire, beach obstacles extending 500 meters into tidal zones, mines emplaced at calculated density, wire obstacles positioned at exact specifications, everything prepared to slaughter any landing force. Goth's aide asked the question every defender contemplated regarding when the invasion would come. Goth's assessment, recorded in his position log, identified June as most probable. The Allies required good weather, calm seas, favorable tides, adequate moonlight for airborne operations. All conditions aligned optimally in June, and when they came, they would discover what happened when military theory met the strongest defensive position ever constructed. This confidence was universal among officers stationed along the Atlantic Wall. They possessed superior tactical position. They possessed adequate firepower. They possessed 3 years of preparation. They had studied Allied capabilities and calculated required responses. What they didn't possess was any accurate information suggesting they were guarding the wrong beaches entirely. June 5th. General Dwight Eisenhower stood before meteorological charts at Southwick House and confronted the most consequential decision of his career. The decision would be made on the basis of weather prediction, an imprecise science being asked to provide precise answers. Group Captain James Stagg, senior meteorologist for the operation, presented his analysis. A high-pressure system would arrive over the Channel on June 5th, creating a window of approximately 36 hours of marginally acceptable conditions. Behind that window, more storms. The next favorable weather period wouldn't occur for at least 2 weeks. Outside the briefing room, rain hammered against windows. 156,000 soldiers were already loaded aboard ships. 7,000 vessels were fueled, provisioned, and positioned. 24,000 airborne troops were preparing to board aircraft for night drops. The machinery of invasion was in motion. Delay meant unloading everything, waiting 2 weeks minimum, hoping for better weather that might not materialize. Dealing with security compromises from 156,000 men who knew the invasion target. Managing morale degradation from forces psychologically prepared for immediate action. Eisenhower made his decision at 04:15 hours on June 5th. The invasion would proceed on June 6th. What Eisenhower didn't know was that German meteorologists, using different data collection points and different analytical methods, had predicted a week of severe storms, making invasion operations impossible. Based on this forecast, senior German commanders had relaxed alert status across the entire Western Front. Field Marshal Rommel had departed France on June 4th, driving to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday on June 6th. Senior commanders had scheduled war games at Rennes for June 6th. Coastal defenders had reduced alert status to normal levels. The bad weather that concerned Eisenhower would give the Allies the one advantage they needed most desperately: strategic surprise. Not because Germans didn't expect invasion in Normandy eventually, but because they had calculated invasion was impossible during this specific weather window. Meanwhile, in La Roche-Guyon, Rommel's chief of staff reviewed meteorological reports and felt relieved. The forecast called for major storms throughout the coming week, no possibility of invasion during this period. The Field Marshal's decision to visit Germany was perfectly timed. He would return in 3 days, well before weather improved enough to make invasion feasible. As this weather assessment circulated through German command, 5,000 ships carrying the invasion force were already at sea. 0200 hours. Gefreiter Otto Zimmermann stared at his radar scope at Coastal Observation Station 154 and experienced something his training had never prepared him for. The screen showed hundreds of returns, possibly thousands. He tapped the unit with standard troubleshooting procedure. Nothing changed. The returns remained, extending across his entire screen at ranges from 40 kilometers to 15 kilometers, all moving south at approximately 10 knots. Zimmermann called his section commander, Unteroffizier Schmidt, who confirmed the malfunction hypothesis initially. that many surface contacts was impossible. The scope was showing weather interference or equipment ghost returns. Schmidt looked at the screen. His expression changed immediately. His training recognized what Zimmermann's inexperience couldn't initially process. These weren't ghost returns. These were real contacts. Schmidt called Coastal Command immediately. His report, logged at 0207 hours, stated that Coastal Radar Station 154 was reporting multiple surface contacts in very large numbers, estimating hundreds of vessels with possibly more, and recommended immediate alert. The duty officer's response, also logged, requested that Schmidt describe contact characteristics in detail. Schmidt reported range, bearing, approximate speed, and estimated numbers. The duty officer's assessment came quickly. Weather returns. Atmospheric conditions over the channel often created false radar contacts. Station 154 should file a maintenance report in the morning and continue monitoring. The line disconnected. Schmidt called again, reaching a different operator who connected him to a major. Schmidt's second report was more emphatic, stating that they had confirmed massive surface contact approaching the Normandy coast. That visual confirmation was impossible in darkness, but that radar showed approximately 6,000 vessels minimum. The major's response came immediately. Schmidt was instructed to take the radar system offline, switch to backup system, and report immediately if backup showed the same contacts. Schmidt switched to the backup system installed for exactly this type of equipment verification. The backup system showed identical returns, thousands of surface contacts all moving south, all approximately 20 kilometers from the French coast. At 0245 hours, lookouts on coastal positions reported seeing ships on the visual horizon. Schmidt called headquarters a final time, with visual confirmation that thousands of ships were approaching across the entire visible sector. The major's response confirmed that general alert was being issued and all coastal units were being brought to combat status immediately. But the ships were already within 25 miles of shore, moving at 10 knots. They would reach landing range in approximately 2 hours. Given the time required to man positions, call up reserves, request authorization for panzer movements, and actually move armored units to threatened beaches, there wouldn't be adequate time to respond. The 2 hours between detection and landing would doom German defensive response before it began. Meanwhile, at Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler continued sleeping. His aides maintained strict adherence to standing orders not to wake the Führer for anything less than confirmed invasion. The reports arriving from France seemed impossible to believe. 6,000 ships, obviously equipment malfunction, weather interference, nervous sentries in darkness seeing amplified shadows. Staff would wait for confirmation, wait for daylight, wait for certainty that didn't rely on potentially faulty radar returns. By the time certainty arrived with dawn's light, 100,000 Allied soldiers would be firmly ashore. 0530 hours. HMS Warspite's 15-inch guns opened the naval bombardment of Normandy at precisely 0530 hours, 8 massive guns firing 1,938-pound shells in coordinated salvos. The shells arced through pre-dawn darkness and fell on German positions with devastating accuracy. Within 3 minutes, 22 other battleships joined the bombardment. Texas, Arkansas, Nevada, Ramillies. 5 battleships total, 48 heavy guns, all firing in coordinated patterns against pre-selected targets. 23 cruisers added their firepower. Over 100 destroyers moved closer to shore, engaging specific strongpoints with direct fire. The naval bombardment of Normandy had begun. The sound could be heard in Paris, 150 miles away. Oberst Ernst Goth stood in Widerstandsnest 62 when the first salvo fell. The explosion threw him against concrete walls. Dust filled the bunker. Emergency lighting failed immediately. When backup lighting engaged, Goth staggered to his feet with blood streaming from a forehead laceration. His first command demanded immediate status report from all positions. The response came through surviving communication lines reporting that Position 3 had been destroyed by direct hit with 12 men dead and 2 guns disabled. Another salvo struck before Goth could issue further orders. The bunker shook violently. Concrete dust cascaded from ceiling joints. One explosion hit the ammunition storage area, killing 12 additional men and disabling 2 more artillery pieces. Goth reached for the telephone connecting him to regimental headquarters. The line was dead. All landlines had been cut by the initial bombardment. He ordered radio contact with any available unit. His message, transmitted at 0547 hours and preserved in military archives, reported that WN-62 was under major attack with thousands of ships visible offshore, requiring immediate reinforcements and suffering heavy casualties from naval bombardment. The response requested confirmation regarding thousands of ships. Goth confirmed that thousands were visible across the entire sector. Naval bombardment continued for 90 minutes. Over 10,000 shells of various calibers fell on Omaha Beach defensive positions during this period. Fortifications held structurally, the concrete was sound, but everything else was systematically destroyed. Communication lines, supply routes. Personnel caught outside reinforced positions. At 0630 hours, naval guns adjusted their fire inland. Landing craft began their final approach to the beaches. Goth moved to an observation slit and looked toward the channel. The horizon was solid with landing craft, hundreds of small vessels with flat fronts, each loaded with troops. The first wave was already within 1,000 yards of shore. Goth issued orders to all surviving positions, instructing them to prepare to engage landing craft at maximum effective range and wait for optimal targeting solutions at water's edge where boats would pause to disgorge troops. Landing craft came through the obstacle field. Some struck mines, exploding in fireballs visible across the beach. Others snagged on hedgehogs and tetrahedrons, forcing soldiers to wade through chest-deep water under fire. German machine guns opened fire at 0631 hours, but there were too many boats. For every landing craft hit, 3 more appeared behind it. The beach filled with American soldiers, running for cover, falling, getting up, running again. Goth's defenders fired until machine gun barrels overheated, waited 30 seconds for cooling, fired again. The killing became mechanical. Point weapon, pull trigger, watch men fall, repeat until barrel overheats, cool barrel, resume firing. But still the Americans came. By 0700 hours, over 2,000 American soldiers were on Omaha Beach. Approximately half had become casualties, but the remaining 1,000 were advancing, destroying obstacles, taking defensive positions one by one. Goth's radio operator reported inability to reach division headquarters. All lines of communication were down. Regiment could be contacted, but regiment couldn't reach higher command. The entire command structure had been severed by the naval bombardment that had systematically destroyed every communication node. Goth ordered a message transmitted through whatever channels remained, stating that WN-62 required armor support immediately and that Americans were on the beach in division strength. The operator asked for clarification regarding division strength. Goth looked at the beach, thousands of men visible, more landing every minute, landing craft extending to the horizon behind the assault waves. He confirmed that tens of thousands were present and that this was the invasion. Meanwhile, at regimental headquarters, Major Hans Weber received Goth's report and struggled to comprehend the scale. Tens of thousands at Omaha alone. Utah Beach was reporting similar numbers, Sword, Gold, and Juno beaches likewise. Every beach under simultaneous assault by forces that exceeded every pre-invasion estimate. He attempted calling division headquarters. All telephone lines were non-functional. He tried calling Corps headquarters. Nothing. The entire communication network had been systematically destroyed by precision naval bombardment that had targeted every command node shown on maps captured during previous commando raids. Weber dispatched a motorcycle courier to division headquarters at 0715 hours with urgent message stating that immediate panzer support was required and that invasion was in progress across the entire Normandy coast. The courier would reach division headquarters at 0830 hours. Division would attempt contacting Army Group, which would attempt waking Hitler, who would eventually authorize limited panzer deployment. By the time tanks actually moved toward beaches, it would be afternoon, and 150,000 Allied soldiers would be firmly ashore. 0900 hours. Adolf Hitler entered the operations room at Berchtesgaden wearing a bathrobe at 0900 hours, 9 hours after the invasion had begun. 9 hours during which approximately 100,000 Allied soldiers had landed on 5 separate beaches. General Alfred Jodl stood before the situation map, eyes bloodshot from sleepless hours, hands trembling slightly as he prepared to brief the Führer on the situation. Hitler's first question demanded to see exactly what was happening. Jodl indicated 5 red markers on the Normandy coast and reported that Allied forces had landed at these locations, that naval bombardment had commenced at 0530 hours, that first waves had landed at approximately 0630 hours, and that current estimates suggested 50,000 to 70,000 troops were already ashore, with numbers increasing continuously. Hitler studied the map in silence. 5 beaches, 200 kilometers from Calais, where his largest forces waited. His next question addressed the obvious discrepancy, asking why Normandy rather than Calais. Jodl confirmed that the landings were in Normandy, not Calais. Hitler's finger traced the coastline from Normandy to Calais. 200 kilometers separated his defensive concentration from the actual invasion beaches. He asked about fleet size. Jodl reported that coastal observers had documented thousands of vessels, that the number was imprecise because the sheer quantity had overwhelmed observers' ability to count accurately. Hitler's response reflected his strategic certainty, questioning whether thousands of ships would be committed to a diversion operation. Jodl hesitated before responding. His suggestion, offered carefully, proposed that even if Normandy was a diversion, it represented a major operation requiring strong defensive response. Hitler's reply came forcefully. He demanded to know where the 1st United States Army Group was located and where Patton's force that intelligence had tracked was positioned. Jodl confirmed that Fusag remained positioned opposite Calais, and that Patton's forces hadn't moved from southeast England. Hitler's strategic assessment followed logically. Therefore, Normandy must be a diversion. The Allies were committing forces to Normandy. Germany would strip Calais defences to respond. Then the real invasion, Patton's massive force, would land at the weakened Calais sector, while German reserves were committed in Normandy. He could see through their deception clearly. The logic was perfect. The logic was perfectly wrong. Because Fusag didn't exist. The 12 divisions opposite Calais didn't exist. The 150,000 troops that intelligence tracked didn't exist. But German intelligence believed completely in Fusag's existence. They had seen landing craft, rubber inflatables photographed at distance, tanks, plywood mock-ups, radio traffic entirely fabricated, photographs carefully staged. Agent reports from double agents controlled by British intelligence. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was completely fabricated. But nobody in Hitler's headquarters knew that. Hitler demanded clarification regarding how many Allied divisions were currently engaged in Normandy. Jodl consulted reports and stated that at least 5 divisions were in first assault waves, possibly more now. Hitler's response demonstrated his strategic calculation. He questioned whether the Allies wanted him to believe 5 divisions represented their main effort, when they had 20 divisions at Calais? Obviously not. This was clearly a diversion. Jodl wanted to argue. 5 divisions in first wave suggested 15 by evening, 50 within a week. This was not how militaries conducted diversionary operations. But contradicting the Führer achieved nothing in these meetings. Hitler demanded accounting of German response, asking how many divisions had been committed to Normandy. Jodl reported that the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division had been released from reserve, 2 divisions against 5 Allied divisions. Hitler found this sufficient for containing a diversionary operation. The remaining 17 divisions would stay at Calais. All 19 divisions would remain in position. He would not be deceived by obvious Allied deception plans. Hitler studied the map more carefully and asked about Luftwaffe response. Jodl reported that German forces had flown 319 sorties during daylight hours. Hitler asked about Allied air operations. Jodl's response, delivered quietly, stated that Allied sorties were estimated at 14,674. Silence followed this statement. 14,000 Allied aircraft sorties, 300 German, a ratio of 46 to 1 air superiority. Hitler requested repetition of the numbers. Jodl repeated that Allies had flown approximately 14,674 sorties and German forces 319. The numbers came from multiple observation posts and were considered reliable. Hitler's posture changed slightly. Some rigidity appeared in his bearing. He asked where German fighters were positioned. Jodl explained that most were grounded due to insufficient fuel, and that remaining forces were held in reserve for the anticipated main invasion at Calais. Reserve forces for an invasion that would never come, held back while the actual invasion consolidated control of French beaches. Hitler's next question addressed the planned counterattacks, asking when panzer forces would reach the beaches. Jodl consulted with his operations officer. The whispered consultation lasted 30 seconds. Jodl's face went pale before he responded. His report stated that the 12th SS Panzer Division had advanced 3 kilometers before being halted by concentrated air attacks, that casualties had been severe, and that Panzer Lehr Division was still en route with movement severely delayed by continuous air attacks along all approach routes. Hitler asked for clarification regarding whether they had been stopped by air attacks. Jodl confirmed that Allied air superiority over the battlefield was absolute and that German ground forces couldn't move during daylight without sustaining severe losses from air attack. Hitler walked to the window. Outside, the Bavarian Alps stretched toward the horizon, 600 miles from the beaches where Germany's fate was being decided by forces he couldn't see and apparently couldn't stop. He asked about troop projections, specifically how many Allied soldiers would be ashore by nightfall. Jodl estimated that if current landing rates continued, perhaps 150,000 troops would be ashore by midnight. Hitler asked about tomorrow's projections. Jodl estimated another 100,000 troops, possibly more depending on weather and German defensive effectiveness. Hitler made his decision, stating that 1 additional Panzer Division from Calais reserves would be committed. The 2nd Panzer Division would move to Normandy. Jodl began to protest that this would weaken Calais defences. Hitler interrupted, stating that 1 division only would be committed. The remaining 18 divisions would stay at Calais. 3 panzer divisions would be sufficient to contain the Normandy diversion until the real invasion began. Jodl said nothing. What could be said? That the real invasion wouldn't come. That 3 panzer divisions would face 48 Allied divisions within a month. That this decision was dooming Germany before the day ended. Nothing useful could be said. Hitler dismissed his staff with orders for hourly updates. He requested immediate contact with Rommel. As officers filed out, Jodl remained for one final piece of intelligence. Coastal observers were reporting total vessel counts approaching 7,000 ships. Hitler laughed at this figure. He stated that 7,000 ships for a diversionary operation was obvious propaganda, that the Americans wanted Germany to believe they possessed overwhelming strength. and that these reports were classic deception tactics. But Jodl knew the reports weren't propaganda. 17 separate observation posts had reported similar counts. Radar stations confirmed, reconnaissance aircraft documented, naval units verified, all sources reporting the same impossible number, approximately 7,000 vessels. What Jodl didn't know was that those 7,000 ships represented only the first wave, that another 3,000 vessels were preparing for follow-up operations. What Jodl didn't know was that at that precise moment, American shipyards were completing another Liberty ship. That American industry built cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. What Jodl didn't know was that Hitler's decision to retain forces at Calais would be studied by military historians for decades as one of history's most catastrophic strategic failures. What Jodl didn't know was that Rommel would reach headquarters by 2200 hours, assess the situation, and tell Hitler directly that Normandy was the real invasion requiring immediate commitment of all available forces, and Hitler would refuse. What Jodl didn't know was that by late July, 6 weeks later, when Hitler finally accepted that Normandy was the main invasion, over 350,000 Allied soldiers would be firmly established in France, with enough supplies stockpiled for months of operations. But standing in the operations room at 0930 hours, Jodl knew one thing with absolute certainty. Hitler had just made the decision that would kill Germany. Not through action, but through inaction. Not through wrong moves, but through failure to move at all. And 150 miles away, 100,000 Allied soldiers were proving that certainty correct with every step they took inland. 2200 hours. Erwin Rommel reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon at 2145 hours, 12 hours after learning of the invasion during his drive back from Germany. His staff had compiled all available intelligence reports. Rommel read them in silence, his expression darkening with each page. 5 beaches secured, air supremacy absolute, naval bombardment overwhelming, counterattacks failed, communication networks destroyed, reserves unavailable. 150,000 troops ashore and reinforcements landing continuously. Rommel's first question addressed the obvious, asking what panzer reserves had been released. His chief of staff reported that 2 divisions had been authorized, that the 12th SS Panzer Division had advanced 3 kilometers before being stopped by air attacks, and that Panzer Lehr was still en route, delayed by continuous air interdiction. Rommel's response was bitter, noting that 2 divisions were being deployed against 5 Allied divisions already ashore, with more landing every hour. His aide explained that the Führer believed the main invasion would still come at Calais. Rommel struck his desk hard enough to scatter papers. His statement declared that the main invasion was here, in Normandy, right now, and that anyone with eyes could see it. His staff maintained silence. Rommel demanded the count again, asking how many ships observers had reported. Multiple observers had documented thousands of vessels. Estimates ranged from 5,000 to 8,000. The exact number was uncertain, but clearly in the thousands. Rommel studied the situation map. His finger traced the 5 landing beaches. He noted the thin German markers attempting to contain massive Allied presence. He turned to his chief of staff with orders to connect him to the Führer immediately. 20 minutes later, Hitler came on the telephone line. The conversation, documented in multiple post-war accounts, lasted 7 minutes. Rommel's assessment was direct, stating that this was the invasion, the main invasion, not a diversion, that everything the Allies possessed was being committed to Normandy, and that Germany needed to commit all available forces immediately, or the battle would be lost. Hitler interrupted with a question about Calais and about the 1st United States Army Group positioned opposite Calais. Rommel stated flatly that there would be no landing at Calais, that this was the invasion, that 5 beaches and massive forces with complete air and naval superiority meant that if Germany didn't stop them now, within the week, they would be unstoppable. Hitler's response was firm. He stated that the field marshal was too close to the situation and could see only what was directly in front of him, that he saw the strategic picture, that 1st United States Army Group hadn't moved, that Patton hadn't committed, and that this was exactly the diversion he had predicted. Rommel attempted to explain that they were seeing the Allies' best forces right now, that 5 divisions minimum with massive air and naval support represented. Hitler interrupted, instructing him to hold them with the forces he had, and stating that the 15th Army stays at Calais. The discussion was concluded, the line disconnected. Rommel stood holding the dead telephone. His staff watched in complete silence. He replaced the receiver carefully. His statement was matter of fact, reporting that the 15th Army would stay at Calais, that 19 divisions would remain there, and that they would fight with what they had. His operations officer asked the question everyone was thinking, inquiring whether they could stop the invasion with current forces. Rommel looked at the map, at 5 beaches, at the thin German defensive markers trying to contain massive Allied presence. His answer was documented in multiple accounts. No, they couldn't stop the invasion. Germany needed to stop them on the beaches during the first 6 hours. Both opportunities were lost. Now, they could only delay the inevitable. Someone asked how long they could delay. Rommel's response was bleak but realistic, stating that they could delay until the Allies broke out of the beachhead, which they would do, and that the only question was timing. The staff stared in shock at this assessment. Operations officer protested that surely with proper counterattacks. Rommel interrupted, asking with what forces. 2 panzer divisions that couldn't move during daylight, against 5 Allied divisions already ashore, growing to 10 by tomorrow, 20 by next week. Against absolute Allied air superiority that prevented German movement. He turned back to the map. His final assessment of June 6th was documented in his log. Germany had lost Normandy, would lose France, would lose the war. The only remaining question was how long the dying would continue. 7,000 ships. The number sounded like propaganda. The kind of exaggerated figure meant to demoralize rather than inform. Numbers that couldn't possibly be real. But 7,000 was real. Photo analysts spent 2 days counting vessels in Hartmann's single photograph. Final count, 847 ships visible in one frame, less than 1/6 of the total fleet. The final official count would be 6,139 vessels, close enough to 7,000 that the early estimates were remarkably accurate. This number represented the largest assembly of ships in human history, more ships than had participated in all previous amphibious operations in history combined. Think about what 7,000 ships meant in practical terms. If you counted 1 ship per second without pause, it would take 1 hour and 56 minutes just to count them all. If you lined them bow to stern, they would stretch over 400 miles, the distance from Paris to Berlin. The steel used in constructing those ships weighed approximately 4 million tons. Germany's entire steel production for 1943 was 30 million tons. The Allies had dedicated 13% of 1 year's steel production to ships for a single day's operation. The crews manning those ships numbered 195,000 sailors, more personnel than the entire Kriegsmarine, more than the population of Nuremberg. An entire city of sailors dedicated to one operation. But the most devastating number wasn't 7,000 ships, it was 0. 0 successful German air attacks on the invasion fleet, not because the Luftwaffe didn't try. German pilots flew 319 sorties on June 6th. They attacked bravely, many died trying. But against 14,674 Allied sorties, those 319 German aircraft were meaningless. The ratio, 46-1, told the real story. Germany couldn't contest the air, couldn't protect its own troops, couldn't even observe the battlefield clearly because Allied aircraft controlled every altitude from sea level to 30,000 feet. 46 to 1 meant that for every German plane that managed to take off, 46 Allied aircraft were airborne. It meant German pilots were flying into mathematical certainty of death. It meant the Luftwaffe had already lost the battle for Normandy before the invasion began. Think about what 46 to 1 meant for German soldiers on the beaches. Every time they tried to move, Allied aircraft attacked. Every time they tried to reinforce, Allied aircraft destroyed the roads. Every time they tried to counterattack, Allied aircraft turned their columns into burning wreckage. The soldiers in the bunkers could fight brilliantly. It didn't matter, they couldn't move without being killed from above, and the number that would haunt German commanders for the rest of their lives. 19 divisions. 19 divisions of the 15th Army sat at Calais on June 6th. 300,000 men, over 1,000 tanks. Enough combat power to destroy any landing force if deployed correctly. They sat at Calais while the invasion happened 200 kilometers away. They sat at Calais for 6 weeks while the beachhead expanded. They sat at Calais because Hitler believed Patton's ghost army was real and Normandy was a diversion. 300,000 men who could have changed the outcome did nothing. Not because they were cowards, German soldiers were among the finest fighters in history, but because they followed orders, because their supreme commander had convinced himself that reality was propaganda and propaganda was reality. 19 divisions stayed at Calais, defending against an invasion that would never come. 5 Allied divisions landed at Normandy. By the time Hitler finally released those 19 divisions 6 weeks later, 50 Allied divisions were firmly established in France. The mathematics don't lie. 7,000 ships plus 19 divisions doing nothing equals defeat. The equation was simple. The result was inevitable. Germany lost D-Day not through lack of courage. German defenders fought brilliantly, inflicting 10,000 Allied casualties on June 6th alone. Not through lack of preparation. The Atlantic Wall was real, formidable, exactly as designed. Germany lost through the fundamental inability to accept information that contradicted ideological certainty, through choosing belief over evidence, through selecting wishes over facts. The 7,000 ships weren't just vessels, they were proof. Proof that American industrial capacity exceeded German comprehension. Proof that the Allies could build faster than Germany could destroy. Proof that the war was already over and the dying was just mathematical inevitability playing out. Hartmann understood this at 0047 hours when he couldn't count the ships. Goth understood at 1347 hours when he surrendered. Rommel understood at 2200 hours when Hitler refused to commit reserves. They understood that mathematics had written the verdict. 7,000 ships, 14,000 aircraft sorties, 150,000 troops in one day, against 19 divisions sitting uselessly at Calais because reality wasn't what the Führer expected. The dying would continue 11 more months. But on June 6, 1944, when 7,000 ships appeared on the horizon, the outcome was already decided, not through battle, through arithmetic. The kind of arithmetic that doesn't care about will or courage or fighting spirit or ideological purity. 7,000 ships equals victory. Zero acceptance of reality equals defeat. The numbers never lied. They never do. The day 7,000 ships appeared, Hitler realized the invasion had begun. More importantly, he realized Germany had already lost. Not through lack of courage, German soldiers at Omaha Beach fought with devastating effectiveness, inflicting 2,400 American casualties. Not through lack of preparation. The Atlantic Wall represented 3 years of construction, 17 million cubic meters of concrete, the most formidable defensive system ever built. Germany lost through the systematic inability to accept information that contradicted ideological certainty. Hitler believed Calais was the invasion target because it made perfect strategic sense. the shortest channel crossing, the most direct route to Germany. The logical choice for any rational enemy. When intelligence reported Normandy, he rejected it. When radar reported 7,000 ships, he dismissed it as equipment malfunction. When reality contradicted his expectations, he chose to believe his expectations. That choice, ideology over information, belief over evidence, wishes over mathematics, killed Germany before the first Allied soldier touched French sand. The 7,000 ships represented more than naval assets. They were proof of civilizational capacity that exceeded German comprehension, proof that American industry could build faster than German U-boats could sink, proof that the war had already been decided by production statistics rather than battlefield courage. Hartmann understood this truth at 0047 hours when his count became meaningless. Goth understood at 1347 hours when ammunition ran out. Rommel understood at 2200 hours when Hitler refused to accept reality. They understood that mathematics had rendered judgment. 7,000 ships, 14,000 aircraft, 150,000 troops in a single day, against 19 divisions defending the wrong beach because the Führer knew better than his eyes. The dying would continue 11 more months. But on June 6, 1944, when 7,000 ships appeared on the horizon, the outcome was already written, not through battle, through mathematics, the kind that doesn't yield to courage or ideology or will. 7,000 ships equals victory. 0 successful escapes from reality equals defeat. The numbers don't lie. They never did.